Warning: the following presentation is intended for mature audiences and it contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and strong language. This podcast represents the opinions of the hosts and their guests, and every effort is made to ensure that information is accurate. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome, fellow armchair detectives. I'm your host, Ashleigh.
And I'm your host, Tamlyn Rossouw.
And this is Just in Crime. Join us as we explore the issue of gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa
by exploring the victims and their stories.
Hey all you armchair detectives, and welcome to today's episode of Just in Crime. Today is going to be another one of those episodes where we have a discussion about a certain topic. So we did an episode earlier on and we had a discussion about gender-based violence and basically discussed what gender-based violence is. And we essentially looked back at South Africa's history and how that plays a massive role as a root issue that's contributing to femicide.
So that episode for us was really interesting to do, and I know I personally enjoyed speaking about it. And so I guess we can consider this episode like a continuation of that one, as we're going to be looking at many of the cases where gender-based violence can essentially escalate to a case of femicide.
I think the main reason we started Just in Crime was because we had this idea and we were cool, we're going to start looking at cases. We're going to take the Fallen Angels list, which for those of you who don't know, it's a list of names that represent the beautiful souls of women and girls who have tragically been lost and murdered in South Africa. And the list was begun by Cindy September on a group called SA Women Fight Back. And we randomly select cases from this list. And as we started doing our research, we ran into a bit of a bump in the road. We got to a point where we were asking the question of if it wasn't for the Fallen Angels list, how are we going to choose what cases? Because how do we know if it's femicide or just a homicide? What is the difference between the two? And I think we became very aware of how, as much as we always hear about gender-based violence and femicide in the media and we see all the protests, we don't know what that actually means. And what we can know about femicide in regard to the South African context, as well as how it stands in relation to cases that we cover.
Yeah, so as you said, we speak about it often, and the issue of femicide is basically, it's become so bad that at the moment it's basically considered the most extreme form of violence on a continuum of violence, of discrimination against women and girls. And as we mentioned on the previous episode, that it has currently been declared a national crisis by our president.
So for those of you who are not fully grasped with the scale of how big this problem is, consider the fact that the coronavirus pandemic, which is a virus that is literally killing thousands and thousands of people, and in the same breath, the killing of women and children is also being declared a pandemic. And that's really how bad the issue is. We are being killed.
Exactly. So basically, for anyone who's ever had to sort out any problem in their life, they know that basically the first step to addressing and fixing any issue is basically defining it and getting a good understanding of what you're dealing with. So basically, when we look at how to define femicide, we're basically looking at the killing of any girl or woman. Now, usually the crime would have to be motivated by the fact that the person is a girl or a woman. However, in a lot of these cases, we don't ever get a crystal clear motive. As we explored in the gender-based violence episode, there's also a lot of root causes that can be found within South African history that play a lot of factors. But sometimes these are at such a subconscious level that it never really shines through. And because of that, we can't really fully ever understand what motivated a crime at its core. And so this is why femicide has been given such a broad definition, like the killing of women and girls.
Yeah, and I mean, with it being so broad, it allows us to explore a wide variety of situations and draw a very clear narrative. We can go from it being more direct violence in that you're attacked physically either by an intimate partner or in an armed robbery, or it could be more indirect in the sense that you are more collateral damage.
Yeah, so basically what we mean by collateral damage, that would be in cases of gang-related activities, which we know is obviously very prevalent in many parts of South Africa, or deaths linked to human trafficking. And for many children in South Africa, a simple case of neglect that results in death is also considered femicide. But yeah, basically there is a very, very long and extensive list of the types of femicide, as you know, Tam. But basically, I feel the best way to approach this is we're going to go through the different cases that we've covered or will be covering in future episodes and series, and basically just unpack what really went on there in terms of the term femicide. And we're also going to be making reference to other well-known cases in South Africa along the way.
I agree. And I think we should start with the most well-known form of femicide, which is basically intimate partner femicide. And we see this one a lot in South Africa. So just to give you the gist of it, it's basically when a woman is killed by a current or former partner. Some of the cases that we will cover in the series are cases like Kamira Rajbunsi, Ashika Singh, and Fatima Patel. So in all of these cases, they were killed by a person that they were in a romantic relationship with. And then when we look at the case of Kamira, she was killed by her boyfriend, who she had been dating since high school. She broke up with him. He read her personal journal and he was enraged by its contents. And then he brutally murdered her by bludgeoning her head with the frying pan and then stabbing her several times in the chest. And then finally, unceremoniously, dumping her body in a sugarcane field. And then we also have the case of Fatima Patel, who was murdered by her husband after a fight. She'd been hit with a baseball bat. She had also been choked so hard that her tongue bone broke. And then she was shot at close range. And he later went on to kill his mother shortly after. And then lastly, we have Ashika Singh, who was killed by her long-term boyfriend after he had a wild night out drinking and doing crack cocaine. She had been strangled and was found with a plastic bag over her head. And this case was heartbreaking as he was acquitted on all counts of murder.
Yeah, dude. So basically, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, it would be really good for you to listen to the gender-based violence episode first, because in many of these cases, there's usually some form of gender-based violence present, and it can easily progress to femicide. And I mean, specifically when we look at the cases of Kamira and Ashika, we know that at some points in their relationship, there was abuse present, even if it's not at a so obvious level. So in the case of Kamira, I think we can see a lot of psychological and emotional abuse present, in that he was an extremely controlling person to the point where she couldn't even write in her journal without him having to see it. And then we look at the case of Ashika Singh. With her, both partners were allegedly quite abusive to each other, more verbally than anything. It was very emotional and psychological, but only got physical once, if I remember correctly. And while there wasn't any reported violence between Ramiz and Fatima Patel, just from the type of person I've read he is, I find it very hard to believe that he would avoid violence when he's prone to it. And I feel he's just a naturally controlling person. So I could suspect that there may have been, even though nothing was ever confirmed. But I mean, that is just my 2 cents of my uneducated opinion.
Exactly. I think that we can see in all of these cases, and specifically with the case of intimate partner violence, verbal abuse often escalates to violence. And this tactic is used by the abuser as a way to take away the dignity, liberty, and rights of the victim. So murder is obviously like the ultimate form of silencing that person and like displaying the ultimate form of I'm more powerful than you.
Yeah, dude. And I think what's like really scary to see that when we look at these situations where men are like asserting and abusing their power, and in many of these cases where it goes too far and results in death, but this can happen in like every like single socioeconomic group. It doesn't matter like what cultural group you belong to, how old you are. It's such a widespread issue that at this point it's basically become like unavoidable. I think it's also important to remember that sometimes when we're looking at like intimate partner violence, it doesn't necessarily have to be committed by like a romantic partner, and it would still be considered like an intimate partner. So like this could be the case of like a parent who kills their child, which was like absolutely heartbreaking. I know a case like this in May of 2020 recently happened where a woman, or rather like a young girl, because she's like 19, in KwaZulu-Natal basically set her 10-year-old month baby alight and then went to the police station and told them that she was missing.
I think you meant 10-month-old baby.
Yes, what did I say?
10-year-old month.
Oh, yes, no, 10-month-old baby, for sure. But basically, yeah, so in the case of that, she is still like, it's still considered an intimate partner violence, even though it was perpetrated by a female to a child. She knew the like victim on obviously a very personal level. Or like in a case that we cover in series 2 with a girl, her name is Ashleigh. You guys might have heard about it in the past. It was quite a big case as it covered like sex work. She was basically a sex worker, not a prostitute. She did more like sensual massages. And she was actually murdered by a client, but because they had known each other and like I guess gotten quite close to each other, it would be considered like intimate partner violence.
Yeah, and the thing is that in South Africa, we're so multicultural that you get a very wide range of femicide cases. So there's like Muti murders that we cover in series 2, and that's basically when someone is killed with the intention of like harvesting their organs and body parts for Muti, which is specific to South Africa and the South African continent. And you also get dowry murders, where it's basically the death of a married woman. And basically she's murdered or driven to suicide by the continuous harassment and torture of their husbands and in-laws over like a dispute about the dowry.
Yeah, dude. So when you look at South Africa, as we've mentioned, some things are like very, very specific to South Africa, such as like Muti murders. But another thing that is also, I find, more prevalent here than it is overseas and in other countries is basically non-intimate or stranger attacks. So as we've mentioned before, the brutality behind a lot of these acts is what's really terrifying, and I guess kind of makes us it's like the differentiator for our country. And I mentioned this in the gender-based violence conversation, but I'm going to bring it up again. So South Africa basically has like a very hurt and traumatized past that is basically filled with violence and devalues human rights. And we are still feeling like the consequences of that today, and that is seen through the violence and brutality present within the perpetrated crimes. But before I go on and on, Tam, can you basically just explain to me like what non-intimate partner violence would be, or femicide?
Of course. So a non-intimate partner femicide is basically involved in the killing of someone of who they don't know. So this is basically a stranger killing, and I think for many women in South Africa, this is one of the scariest forms of femicide because it's so real for us. It could be like the case of like the 19-year-old Uyinene, whose case we all know very well by now, but she was killed by a government post office worker when she went to go and collect some clothes that she'd ordered online. Or like the second episode that we covered of Antoinette du Plessis, where she was basically killed by a man who did some work on her roof and fixing locks and doors.
And just to jump in, with both of these cases that you just mentioned, I was absolutely shocked at the brutality behind like these murders. Like for Nene, he attempted to strangle her, and then like when that didn't work, he bludgeoned her face with a 2 kg weight and then set her body alight. And then with Antoinette, keep in mind, she didn't really know this guy. So it was absolutely crazy when he attacked her out of nowhere and literally started stabbing her and then slit her throat. And as we discussed in the episode, like slitting someone's throat is a very brutal and difficult thing to do. Like at the risk of sounding redundant, like the levels of brutality that we experience in this country is wild.
No, I completely agree. And that's why the Am I Next movement was so powerful, or is so powerful, because if you're not safe at home and you can't go to the post office or take a walk to the shop, then literally where are you safe? We're constantly living in a state of fear and anxiety, and that's literally like no way to live. But before we continue with today's episode, be sure to check us out on Instagram and Facebook, as well as Twitter at Just in Crime SA for more episodes, case-related content, updates, and other riveting content.
Also, keep in mind, we are not professionals in any of the discussed fields. If you or anyone you know is in danger, you can find resources on our social media pages, or alternatively, you can contact the Gender-Based Violence Command Center at 0800 428 428 or SMS HELP to 31531. Okay, so when I was thinking about the episode and like what we're actually going to speak about, I know in the gender-based violence episode, we basically spoke about what the government is doing in order to combat this massive issue of femicide and gender-based violence. But as I also mentioned in that episode, it appears that no amount of government intervention is going to be impactful enough for us to address this issue. And so we need to start looking at like ourselves and education and any other channel that could be like a viable source to basically address this issue. And so what we're basically going to do is we're going to go through just some things that we've seen like in South Africa that we think is really cool and that's being done to currently like address this issue.
Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Ash and I studied marketing and like branding and stuff. So we always like to look at what brands are doing. And we've started to see that with the fourth industrial revolution in like full swing, brands actually play a very big part in our society as well as in our community. Because they often reflect our views. So basically some of the brands that we've been seeing doing some dope stuff to fight against gender-based violence and femicide include Carling Black Label and Joko. And if you don't know, Joko is a tea brand by Unilever, and Carling Black Label is South Africa's most internationally awarded beer, and the brand is about celebrating the champion in all men. Wow, that was a mouthful.
Oh, dude, here's the thing. I have like such a love-hate relationship for Black Label because, I mean, I don't really drink beer and I know neither do you. But I can understand why it's so popular. It's like, it's not that gross. It's weirdly enjoyable.
Yeah, I don't drink beer, but I will take your statement. But firstly, I want to mention that over this lockdown period, it's become very evident that alcohol is, as we know, a massive driver of violence, as research shows that alcohol and drug abuse are common triggers for violent episodes. But the Carling Black Label wanted to be a force for good, like during lockdown, and it joined the gender-based violence conversation in 2017 with its #NoExcuse initiative and Soccer Songs for Change campaign. And since then, the #NoExcuse campaign has been a core part of Carling Black Label's like responsible marketing. And obviously it's an uncomfortable conversation for an alcohol brand to have, but Black Label understands that like as an industry, they'd be naive to think they were not part of the problem. So why not be part of like the solution, you know? And one of the solutions was like the bravest thing, which is a WhatsApp line that we launch that they launched in partnership with Lifeline and Father Nation, and it offers help to men and women in abusive relationships, and it's a non-judgmental place where victims of abuse and men seeking mentorship can be put in touch with different organizations to get the help they need, most importantly, silently.
What I love about this is it's not only addressing helping survivors, but also in a sense adds a preventative measure, which we don't see a lot in South Africa, by basically allowing those who are perpetrating abuse to also seek help.
I know, right? But basically, something that was really interesting to see with the helpline was that in March, before we went into lockdown and had a ban on alcohol, Lifeline received about 12,000 calls for help. And in April, 1 month into lockdown, calls surged by 500% to 80,000. Over 40% of the calls were from men reaching out for help. They were facing enormous uncertainty that in many cases were not sure how they would be able to provide for their families. So dealing with that pressure, that type of stress, it was just too much for them to bear. And then to make things worse, alcohol dependent people were forced into unsupervised detox, essentially. So basically in South Africa, many families live in close proximity with each other, and they have very little chance of privacy. And in these cases, the result is that victims of abuse can't call for help without their abuser potentially overhearing the call. And the shame of admitting that they need help will stop many men who need guidance from making the call if there is a chance of someone hearing it. So there's no way for anyone to get help silently. And the volume of calls was leading to burnout under counselors at Lifeline. So they basically realized, okay, cool, we need to do more. And so Black Label, like I said, basically announced that due to the spike during lockdown, that the brand has basically promoted a response from various organizations. And the whole Black Label campaign was basically to bring awareness to provide a silent helpline for both victims and offenders. And this campaign has basically done really, really well. And it reached 45 million people worldwide. And I just love this because it's just one of those key pieces of insights that we need to recognize in order to solve the bigger issue. And I just love that they've taken the initiative to take responsibility and accountability for the fact that their product, which is alcohol, does play into a negative role when it comes to fighting gender-based violence and femicide.
Yeah, dude, I completely agree with you. And I just want to slide in here while we're speaking about alcohol to mention just another really cool campaign that I saw happening. So basically this campaign, I guess, has taken the need for people to speak about the issue, specifically men amongst themselves. And so it was started by the NLTC, who basically represents over 34,500 liquor traders in the township space. And they worked in partnership with Rise Against Gender-Based Violence, the South African Police Service, Distel, and Consumer Tech to basically launch a campaign. It's called Tavern Dialogues. So for those of you who don't know what a tavern is, it's basically a bar where people can go and drink. It's very similar to a shebeen. And it's basically become a vital part of township economy and the community. So it's important to I guess utilize them. I also didn't realize that many taverns are actually owned by women, which is so sad because a lot of these men, they'll go to the tavern, have a drink, and then go home and abuse their wives, or sometimes even in some of the cases, the tavern owners. So basically what the program aims to do is basically start a long-term conversation within these different taverns, and they're going to have group facilitators that are going to come through and guide conversations with men where they can speak about gender-based violence and femicide and basically, I guess, what's going on in their communities and with themselves.
What I think we're seeing with the brand initiatives, as well as with government programs such as Patrick Shy's, which we spoke about in the gender-based violence discussion, is this desperate need for men to need a space where they can talk about their issues with other men, to other men.
Yeah, dude. And it comes back to that thing that we also said, hurt people hurt people. And the only way to get rid of that hurt and anger, as we mentioned in the gender-based violence episode, is to speak about it. Like, I know from personal experience that we'll call each other up and we'll talk about the same issue for hours and hours. And it kind of just feels like you're talking about the same thing over and over. But by the time you've stopped talking about it, you have some form of closure. You have a little bit of relief. You have even if it's teeny tiny bit of satisfaction about speaking about the issue. And like what I really love about these initiatives is it goes into each different community and is doing something that is unique for them. So obviously every community has their different set of issues and problems that are unique, and a one-size-fits-all strategy isn't going to work. But with these tavern conversations, they can speak about the issues plaguing their community, what their personal struggles are. And by developing like these smaller communities, I feel like we can basically find solutions and address these issues in a much more quicker and efficient way.
Speaking of communities, do we have any interesting initiatives that are being done by members of the community in South Africa?
Okay, so there was it's actually being run the same time as this podcast is being released. So that's over the 16 days of activism against women and children. So as I mentioned, South Africa is very multicultural. And so we have a lot of different faiths that people follow. So this campaign is basically launched, which is a 70-day joint faith action campaign to end gender-based violence and femicide in South Africa. So the aim is to basically work within different faith communities to overcome harmful attitudes to women and girls, both within their communities and wider spread. So this basically links back to going within every single community and allowing faith and religious leaders to basically lead them in this battle.
This is great because we always hear so many stories about how religious groups are always fighting, and there's been so many wars worldwide and in South Africa specifically. We are known to just be divided in most aspects. So to see people put their differences aside and all work towards one common goal is really encouraging.
Yeah, dude. And we know that religious leaders and leaders of different faiths often have massive influence on people's lives and how they behave. And so I think it's really important for them to get involved and I guess use their platform to guide people away from violence and towards helping each other. So basically the whole campaign aims that each faith leader is basically given a set of activities that he needs to conduct. And some of these activities are basically showcasing successful actions and examples. One thing I love is that they want to do tracking and supporting current and new cases that come up. And then also opening dialogues and harnessing research-based evidence for advocacy in order to help people who are trapped in these really awful situations. So the campaign basically wants to give a voice to the work of various groups as well that are working to educate and transform communities by putting an end to discriminatory gender practices and attitudes. And then they're also going to use this very prominent message campaign to mobilize wider involvement and I guess kind of get different stakeholders involved and more people contributing so that we have more people all fighting against this really, really needed cause, which I think is fantastic because you know how I love a good community-based project.
Oh no, even me. But that really is amazing. And what stands out to be about community-based projects and NGOs and such is that it starts off with one person just deciding to put their life on pause for a moment and help other people. I mean, you and I have worked with a few nonprofits that are aimed at helping all sorts of different issues, and the drive and determination that all these people have who are invited is remarkable, and I think we need to see more of that.
Yeah, dude, and I think if enough individuals all decide to do something, it's kind of that typical thing of a drop in the ocean, but the whole ocean can do something. You know that saying? Yeah, that one they tell us in school. But basically the concept is if we're all working together, we can see some really, really great results a lot quicker. Obviously, though, we know that not everyone has resources and opportunities to help people on a direct level, and you can only do as much as you're able to. So even if it's something like going to a protest, which I know many South African women have participated in.
Yes, and I think before the end of the episode, it's important to basically give a shout out to every person that has participated in any of the protests that have come up recently, or even been vocal about gender-based violence and femicide on their social media platforms.
We know that you don't always know what you're getting into when you go to these protests. And even though I know most of them, if not all of them, have been fairly peaceful, that doesn't mean that they're safe. So we appreciate everyone's individual agency to stand up and say something for all the women and children who can't.
Trust, your efforts have not gone unnoticed. But with that being said, I think that concludes this episode.
Really do want to start having more conversations like these. It's really interesting for us to do because we obviously get to learn so much. So if you have any topics you want us to cover, or if you know of any organizations that are doing some amazing stuff, we'd really love to hear about it. Maybe give them a shout out. But yeah, with that being said, that's it for today's episode.
Be sure to follow us on social media and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. Be sure to check out our social media for more episodes, case-related content, and other riveting info.
We'd also like to give a massive shout out to Christian Putter for creating our theme song. Be sure to check out more of his work on Instagram at Christian_Putter.
And then we would also just like to thank Anthony Catano for creating our album art. So be sure to follow him at @Catano on Instagram.
And lastly, we'd like to give a huge shout out to VU Media for helping produce this podcast. Be sure to follow them on Facebook and Insta at VU_Media SA.